Hey everyone, happy Friday, welcome back. Did Alberta Premier Danielle Smith really say that the Alberta Independence movement is nonsense? According to a few headlines this week, she made that comment on her radio show last Saturday, but I have a different take on what the Premier was trying to say. As well, if Danielle Smith refuses to hold a referendum on Alberta independence, does that mean the independence movement is dead? Of course not, and I'm going to explain to you why. We're going to be focusing on all that and more today. I'm Rachel. Welcome back to Rachel Parker. Okay, and just before we go any further, I wanted to flag for you guys again my Patreon account. Some of you have been asking how you can support my independent journalism, which is all paid for by yours truly. So if you'd like to support my work, you can do that over on my Patreon memberships. There's a few options for you there. Okay, so I want to cover what the Alberta government and of course what Danielle Smith has been saying about the Alberta independence movement, which I've been covering very closely. But I haven't really spent too much time diving into how this is actually playing out in the Alberta government right now. So we're going to do that today. Last week, Danielle Smith did one of her Your Province, Your Premier episodes. They're hosted every other Saturday, I believe. And so last week, she received a few questions about the Team Canada approach with Donald Trump and his tariffs, as well as if she's a closeted separatist. Now we're going to break down all her responses for you today because there was a lot of really good information, a lot of insight as to how she's thinking about the independence movement and certainly how she is willing to speak publicly about it. But I wanted to start with responding to a few news stories that I saw this week, one from, I believe, CTV News, one from the Western Standard, where it was reported that Danielle Smith said the independence movement is nonsense. I'm going to play exactly the segment for you guys so you can hear for yourself what she had to say. Take a listen.
The perception of disunity on the Team Canada approach, coupled with President Trump's talk of Canada being the 51st state, has rekindled debate, if not discussion, about Alberta's separation and or independence.
It's nonsense. The one issue I disagreed with is we cannot have an export tax or export restrictions on oil and gas. That is the one issue that I have disagreed with. And I think I am standing up for Albertans in that regard and preventing a massive escalation in a trade war. We have $150 billion worth of product that goes to the United States. If the federal government slaps a 25% tariff on that, that means that Ottawa will take another $40 billion out of this province, and we know how they take money and distribute it when it comes out of this province. They give it to places where they think they're going to win votes. There is under no circumstances am I going to agree for them to slap an export tariff where the money all goes to Ottawa to be spent by Ottawa politicians. I don't know how I could be more clear on that.
So my take on that clip is not that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is calling the independence movement nonsense, but rather she's responding to claims that she has been stoking the independence movement by not having a Team Canada approach. We've been hearing this about the Premier since basically the start of the trade war. Even before, shortly after Donald Trump was elected, we began, hearing threats of this looming trade war. And basically from the get-go, Danielle Smith was attacked for how she responded to Trump, how she responded to the tariffs. And you can kind of hear in the way that question is posed, they're saying, this Team Canada approach, Donald Trump talking about the 51st state, and now this independence movement. And you can hear in the way that she responds to the question that she is taking the question very personally. She's not talking about the independence movement in Alberta writ large, but rather she's talking about her personal response to it. And this is evident in her response to the question, in which she begins talking about herself, and she says, listen, there was only ever one matter in which I really disagreed with the federal government's response to Donald Trump and his tariffs, and that was that I refused to have export levies on Alberta energy. She says that was the one area where I said, this is never going to happen. I will not allow for this. And then she goes on to say, There was actually a number of ways in which I agreed with the federal government, and I agreed with how the other provinces were responding to the tariffs, and Alberta followed suit. Take a listen to all the ways she gives us examples that she went along with the Team Canada approach.
That being said, I've been supportive of reasonable countermeasures. We have also, we've taken some flack for it. We joined the other provinces in turning off the ordering system for American liquor to just send the message that we're united on that. We have got a buy local campaign that has started. I've said buy local, buy Canadian, and buy from countries that honor their free trade agreements. And we're assessing our procurement policies to see how we might be able to buy more steel and aluminum from Quebec and Ontario. So that is a full Team Canada approach.
So to me, when I listen to this exchange, I do not take this as Danielle Smith responding to the independence movement. I actually think she skirted the question rather effectively, and I believe that we've seen her do this before. When, we're talking about the Alberta Independence movement, she tends to frame it as, well, this is what the federal government is doing. And she often talks about how the federal government has still left the door open to export tariffs on Alberta energy. And she'll essentially say, that is stoking a lot of resentment in my province, and I simply won't allow it. But she really doesn't dive into the nitty-gritty of the Alberta independence movement. And I think we see that again here. She actually skirts the question. She doesn't really want to talk about Alberta independence. And I think that's because it's a bit of a difficult situation for her. I don't think she wants to be known as a premier who is stoking Alberta independence while Alberta is still part of Canada. But at the same time, so many people who voted for her, who still support her, who are in the United Conservative Party are very keen on the idea of Alberta independence. And so she's finding herself a little bit at odds with her base right now. And I think we're going to see her approach this issue very carefully in the continued future. Does this mean that I think Danielle Smith is a closeted separatist who would like to come out in support of the Alberta independence movement, but doesn't think it's the right time? Actually, I don't think so. I think that she's probably uncomfortable with how much of a resurgence this movement is having. And I think she's going to be, as I said, extremely careful with how she speaks about it in public. And I also think she is going to do her best to do what politicians do so often and so well, is that they sort of seek to quietly deal with an issue. And how do they do that? They create a government panel to discuss the problem. And now that is what Danielle Smith is pitching. She is saying, if, the Liberals win the federal election later this month, which I personally believe they are going to, then I'm going to appoint another fair deal panel. It'll essentially be the what's next panel to discuss what's going to come in Alberta. She talked about that more on her radio show. And she also talked about the process through which Albertans could seek an independence referendum. Take a listen.
But we do have mechanisms for referendum in our province. We have a citizen initiated process where if you get enough petition signatures, you can force a vote. We've seen that before. Fluoride has gone to referendum in Calgary during municipal elections. We've seen a number of different other municipalities take that up. There has been a referendum on trying to end equalization. The Fair Deal panel proposed a referendum on a couple of other issues, and so I'll after the election's over, I will do I'm calling it now the What's Next panel. We just want to go around the province, see how people are feeling, and see if there are any other referendum issues that they want us to put on the table. But there is a process for individuals to put those questions forward so that every Albertan can have a say.
Now, this segment is noteworthy to me for two reasons. First, because as I said, she talked about wanting to create this second Fair Deal panel. I know that you guys are pretty familiar with the OG Fair Deal panel, but let's just go over a quick breakdown of it. It was commissioned by former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney in 2019, and it offered a host of recommendations for the province of Alberta, 25 recommendations to improve Alberta's standing within Confederation and to get Alberta a better deal. Some examples of what the panel recommended was an Alberta pension plan, an Alberta police force, fair representation in the House of Commons and in the Senate. Now, when we talk about what this panel actually achieved, sure, we got 25 recommendations of ways life could be better, could be more fair for Albertans who pay $3 billion a year in equalization payments to the rest of Canada while not having received one in 6 decades. But what did you, as an Albertan, actually get out of this panel? Well, you got very little out of it. In fact, only 3 of those recommendations were ever adopted, and one of them was more symbolic than anything else. One of the recommendations that was adopted was to appoint a chief firearms officer to oversee firearms regulation locally. Okay, I've interviewed Alberta's chief firearms officer before. I guess, they do a good job of advocating for firearms issues, but that hasn't exactly stopped the federal government from encroaching on firearms regulations, firearms rights in this country. That hasn't stopped them from banning more of your guns without even passing legislation to do so. Another recommendation given by the Fair Deal panel that was adopted is the Citizens Initiative Act. This is the 24th recommendation, and basically the panel recommended using democratic tools like a referendum and citizens initiative. Now, this passed in 2021 as Bill 27, and the legislation allows Albertans to propose issues for government considerations or referendum if sufficient signatures are gathered directly adopting the recommendation. Okay, this one is important, so you guys are going to want to remember that this was one of the recommendations that was successfully implemented. And finally, the third recommendation that was adopted was a referendum on removing equalization principle from the Constitution Act. Now, 61.7% of Albertans voted in favor of the change, but basically this ended there because in order for this to actually pass and to make a change in Confederation, it would need the support of other Canadian provinces. And why would other provinces essentially vote to stop giving themselves money? And so this basically, we know that Albertans support changing or ending the equalization payments, but it basically died from there, and we haven't seen any further progress on it. So that was the initial Fair Deal panel, 25 recommendations, 3 of them adopted, and 1 of them was mostly symbolic in nature. So this is what Danielle Smith is proposing to do with sort of the angst that we're seeing in this province taking shape in the form of an Alberta Independence resurgence. Is she's saying, well, we're going to put it towards another Fair Deal panel. And I just think that that is a bad idea because I think that these types of panels are where ideas go to die. It allows the government to kick issues down the road for another year or 2, sometimes even 3. And then by the time they receive the report back with the recommendations, well, a lot of times it's too late to actually make any significant changes because they're too close to an election cycle. And they'll say things like, well, we're going to go and we're going to try to get another mandate from voters before we look at this Fair Deal panel, or say there isn't time to get this done before the election panel. And then privately, conservatives will say to each other, well, we can't really expect the government to act on that now because we're so close to an election and it's such a big thing that it could cause the government to lose the election. We've all heard these arguments before. And this is why I think that when we put things to a government panel, it is really just a way of kicking the ball down the court and saying, we'll get to it at a later date. Now, I told you that this segment was noteworthy for 2 reasons. The first was because Danielle had said that she would, implement this What's Next panel if we see a Liberal government elected on April 28th. But additionally, she also talked about the Citizens Initiative Act, which I just explained to you all. That might have been the one thing from the last Fair Deal panel, which actually gave a little bit of power back to Albertans, because if you want to see change in your province, you can force a referendum by collecting enough signatures under this act. Now, it's noteworthy that Danielle Smith signaled in her answer that this was a process through which Albertans could seek a referendum on independence, because she also has the power as a premier and as being in government. She has the power to call a referendum if she so chooses. Under the Constitution Act, the premier could use her powers in the government to call a referendum without using the Citizens Initiative Act. But when Danielle Smith answered that question, she didn't say, if there's enough interest, I'm going to call a referendum. She said, if the people of Alberta want to, they can seek to have a referendum through the Citizens Initiative Act. So I think it's pretty clear to me that we are not going to see Danielle Smith push for this referendum. If the independence movement is serious, if they want to do the work, then it seems like they are going to have to collect enough signatures. Now, I have to note, as many of you are already thinking, that it wouldn't be a small thing for Danielle Smith to call for a referendum on independence. She would essentially be saying, let's have a vote on Alberta's secession from Canada. And if that was to fail and she was the individual who had called for it, it would be nearly impossible for her to stay on as premier, which is probably in part why we're seeing her try to skirt this issue and just be very cautious in how she approaches it, because it could mean the end of her premiership if she isn't careful. At the same time, and I said this on a podcast recently, and a couple of you reached out and said they didn't agree, but I definitely think I'm right on this one. If we were to somehow see a successful referendum on independence, and we were to see Alberta move towards succession and eventually achieve that, I do not believe it would be possible for Danielle Smith to stay on as leader. Obviously, Alberta would become its own country, and we would see significant rewriting of laws and, how our government works. But I don't know that Danielle Smith would be able to stay on, because she would have been seen as someone who was really, at the very best, neutral on this issue. And I suspect that the people who would push for this issue and were eventually successful would want to replace her with somebody who had been supportive of Alberta independence from the get-go. So I think that there's sort of two sides of this coin, if you will. Danielle Smith is being cautious in how she's approaching it, because she probably knows it will cost her support within Canada, and maybe even within Alberta if she voices support for Alberta separation, but at the same time, she can't come out opposed to it, because it'll cause her to lose support with her base, where this idea is very popular right now. And so we're sort of seeing her skirt this issue, and I think we'll continue to see that happen over the weeks and months to come. But if we get to this point where we see a Liberal government elected, where the independence movement is rolling, it'll be very difficult for her to not come out in support of it one way or the other. I think we'll probably continue to see this language of, well, it's up to the people of Alberta to decide. But as I said, if we ever got to that place where there was a successful independence referendum and she hadn't been in support of it, I just don't think her leadership could survive that, should Alberta succeed Canada. But that's my 2 cents. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you think that Danielle Smith is secretly a closeted separatist who is waiting to see that there's enough support, and then she's going to sort of hop on the bandwagon and announce her support for it? Or do you think that she's actually opposed to this idea? Or maybe you think that my read on the situation is generally correct and she's doing her best to avoid saying more about independence than she has to, so she doesn't ire Albertans from either side, those for or against the movement. Now, before we end off for today, you guys know that I went down to Calgary, I guess that was last week, to cover Jeff Ross' press conference, to which he basically gave an update on his plans to go down to DC. Most of that content ended up on my X. I didn't do a full episode on the press conference. If you guys would like to see one, let me know. I suspect that you guys probably got your fill of the content from that press conference already. But in it, Jeff was asked, how do you know that Danielle Smith is being serious about this movement? And, how do you know that she's actually going to call a referendum? And he basically said, if she doesn't, we will force her to hold one. Take a listen.
Danielle's actually going to pull the trigger. I mean, people can talk a big game.
Well, we have another way of proceeding, which is called the Citizens Initiative, and that's where the 66,000 volunteers and APP come into place. If Danielle doesn't pull the trigger, we're currently working to gather the signatures that we need to move forward.
Okay, so there you have it. The people in the independence movement are already prepared for the fact that they might have to utilize the Citizens Initiative Act to get the results that they want to see. All right, everyone, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you guys have a great weekend. God bless.